Good afternoon to you, and thanks so much for joining us here at the Daily News. I'm Ginny Simone, coming to you from the United Nations in New York, where more meetings were held again today behind closed doors to draft an international arms trade treaty. I just talked with Tom Mason of the World Forum on the Future of Sports Shooting Activities about the UN moving forward with its agenda to regulate, restrict, and erode our firearm freedoms. Tom, as always, thanks for stopping by. I know we're going to be headed back to the UN, and finally this afternoon, they're going to have open meetings, an open session. And the past couple of days, closed doors.
That's correct, yeah.
So what will we get at today? Will we find any idea what they were talking about?
Theoretically, we're supposed to hear what they're talking about. What they call facilitators. Those of the
UN word.
That's the UN word for the chair people of the chairmen or chairwomen of the closed sessions. They're supposed to report today. That's what we've been told, and they're supposed to bring back a summary of the discussions that occurred behind the closed doors.
So we've heard, Mexico and Uganda pushing for this whole licensing and registration of all firearms at all levels. Is that something that came up in these discussions, do you think?
I don't know, but it's always on the table with the arms trade treaty, because one of the theories behind an arms trade treaty is that you will keep track of small arms, light weapons, or firearms throughout their whole life cycle. And that means from the manufacturing to the importation to the distribution and possession. And they talk about licensing and registration, and sometimes they talk about it in terms of what comes across the border. But then before you know it, they're talking about it in terms of who owns it. And that becomes a very crucial point, because in the American system, we have very tight controls over who actually manufactures. But when it comes to the actual distribution and possession, we do not allow registration. That is contrary to the American system. We don't.
That's why we fight microstamping.
That's right. We don't allow registration because that leads inevitably to government control. It's philosophical, yet it's important. And these discussions in the United Nations tend to slip over into that. They tend to slip from licensing suddenly into registration. Record keeping is one thing. We actually have a pretty good record keeping system in the United States with the manufacturers, and the manufacturers keep the records.
And they're real good about saying that when they get the chance. The NGOs when they get up there.
Yeah, they're very good. They do. So that's how it happens.
So we go into the meeting this afternoon. It's not like they're going to hand out any kind of document or outline of anything they discussed. It's what they're going to want to tell us is what we're going to hear.
I do not know whether or not they'll hand out an outline. The papers that have been handed out here have been actually quite minimal. Mm-hmm. They have the chairman's principles and they have the elements of a treaty. We do not know if there will be a revised version of either one of those. But this is not like Congress or the legislatures where there's a bill you can get your hands on. You can look at the amendments that are being proposed by the various people. Here there's this very unstructured discussion, and then at the end the chairperson through his consultant, puts out a document of what they think the consensus of the group was.
When you say through his consultant, what do you mean by that?
He has a consultant who used to be a member of EANSA. And so it's very interesting.
And is she the one that drafts up this document?
She's the one that'll be doing the drafting.
And that's the reason I was asking that is, we think of drafting a document just copying notes. That's not necessarily the case for this individual. And she has more input than we can imagine.
Yes, she does. And it's kind of like you're the secretary or the reporter of the meeting, but you've got a lot of power in what you put down and what you actually write down. And of course, the chairman himself, he has control of it too. Ambassador Moreton from Argentina.
Yeah, and there's no question when you look at what's going on here. It's as anti-gun as it's always been. But it was interesting because Dave Kopel of the Independence Institute and Ted Broman at the Heritage Foundation wrote a piece talking about the program of action. And we were here in June when that was what they would discuss. And it gets so confusing. And the UN likes to keep it that way. Yes. They have all these different meetings on all these different issues. But what Dave and Ted were talking about was, the POA, the program of action, turning it into a binding treaty. And that is something that has always been there from day one as part of the plan.
That's right, going back all the way back to 1995. Now let's be clear for our audience.
Yeah.
There's the Arms Trade Treaty, which is being discussed right now. And then there's the general United Nations Program on Small Action called the Program of Action.
And that encompasses everything concerning
except
getting
the
rid
Arms
of the
Trade
firearms,
Treaty.
the destruction of firearms.
That's correct. Yeah. So you have now you
except for the treaty.
Yeah, except for now you actually have a whole series of UN programs on small arms, and we could go on for hours describing these programs. The last time I looked, I believe there are 5 or 6 UN programs that affect small arms. One of them is the Arms Trade Treaty that we're here for right now. The other one is the Program of Action, which started in 2001 and which we just met about in June. You and I were here in June.
Right.
Now that's very confusing. Program of Action and ATT. The Koppel article had to do with the Program of Action.
And turning it into a treaty, which is something John Bolton opposed vehemently. I mean, he was right out front saying, no way, Jose.
Absolutely. That was one of the red lines for Bolton in 2001. Another red line, which we were not able to get established, was whether or not this process continues on. And this process continues on with a vengeance.
And that's the Program of Action.
The Program of Action. And then the Program of Action, they're going to have an experts group meeting in May of 2011, which will examine the Program of Action and set the agenda for a major conference, 2-week conference in 2012 on the Program of Action. There very well could be a move at that conference in 2012 to turn the Program of Action into a binding treaty.
And what do you see as the problem with that?
Well, the
danger, as Ted Koppel, as Dave Koppel warns about.
The danger would be that it would have things in it like mandatory registration, that type of thing. But it could be turned into a Christmas tree that we don't like so much. Now, again, one of the ironies is that the Program of Action, they're going to have a 2-week meeting in 2012 on the Program of Action, and then they're also going to have in 2012 a 4-week meeting on the Arms Trade Treaty.
And no fool to anybody that the people involved with the Program of Action are also the same characters involved, pretty much so, with the Arms Trade Treaty.
On both sides.
On both sides.
Let's
admit
it.
Yeah,
on both sides.
Yeah, no. But and what's so interesting and so confusing, as I said, the UN likes to keep it, we're talking about meetings, but they all parallel each other on so many issues. One issue, though, that we are concerned about here is the issue of self-defense. Never been defined, never put in the treaty that it would not be taken away, and still that is the way it is today.
No, very much. In self-defense, you will not hear self-defense discussed at the UN unless it's an NGO like bringing it up, one of the people on our side. Self-defense is a strange concept to the United Nations. You've got to remember the United Nations is a club of governments. Now, the Charter of the United Nations says, we the people establish the United Nations. That's just not the way the United Nations operate. The United Nations is a closed club of governments. You, as an ordinary citizen of any country, can't come to New York or Vienna or Geneva, where the United Nations headquarters are, and there are 3 of them, not 1. You can't come to the United Nations headquarters and walk into the building and see, as we like to say in America, you cannot see the people's business being done. The United Nations is a closed system. And you have to be an NGO or have to be invited or have to get permission even to come into the building. And then once you're in the building, the meetings has to be open. Now, again, we've talked about how the great majority of the United Nations meetings now are closed. They're supposed to be open. Yeah, they're supposed to be transparent, as they say.
But let me ask you something. Whether it's the Program of Action or the arms trade negotiations leading up to wanting to have a treaty, if the UN had its way, wouldn't they all be treaties?
That's a good question.
Because it's binding,
yeah, it's
in
binding
their eyes.
And it gives them power. And the UN is usually where the treaty, there's a place what they call the repository of a treaty. And you've got to understand something about treaties also. Treaties aren't like statutes passed by the Congress or the legislatures that just sit there. Treaties always have a bureaucracy that goes with them to administer the treaty and see how the treaty's gone. And treaties that are still in force will also have annual conferences of parties. So a treaty becomes an institution. A treaty is not just a statute. It becomes an institution. And the one thing the UN is good at, it's good, a few other things it's good at, but one of the things the UN is good at is institution building. It starts, Bolton said this way a long time ago, it starts out as a footnote. and before you know it, 10 years, 20 years later, you have a UN office on such and such.
And you talk about the closed meetings, but all the more reason why it's so important that NGOs like yours, like the NRA, are here, because at least when you get into these open sessions, you can get a grasp of what's going on. But when push comes to shove and they finally come to drafting it, how much input will the NGOs have?
That's a good question. I think that some of the NGOs on the other side are probably already trying to draft an arms trade treaty. They probably have a draft in the can, as we say. They're looking
But how
at
much impact would the NRA and your NGO have in saying, we're against what you're doing on self-defense, we're against what you're doing on registration?
I think we'll have some substantial impact, but we'll have the impact through the governments. We'll also have an impact on our general statements. Some of these, but be very frank, we have been frustrated on some things. We have made statements on the subject of ammunition. They've proposed that ammunition be included on the arms trade treaty, and NGOs, industry have said, countries have said, militaries have said, you just can't have an international scheme to keep track of ammunition. It can't be done. And for some reason, they just have not listened to us. I'm sorry to be frustrated on one point.
No, but they don't listen.
The fact that the United Nations will not listen to non-political expertise, and that's what the industry has said. This is not political. They don't like it is from a political standpoint. This is a completely non-political standpoint. You just can't keep track of billions of rounds of ammunition, and they turn.
And just like the anti-gunners here, when it comes to micro-stamping, they just keep pushing it.
Yeah. Well,
no matter what.
It is. Pardon the pun. It's the magic bullet.
Yep. All righty. Well, thanks as always, and we'll look what happens this afternoon and see what comes out of it, and we'll be back here again with you again tomorrow. Thank you.
Okay.
Also in the news, Elena Kagan is one step closer to having a seat on the U.S. Supreme Court now that the Senate Judiciary Committee has approved her nomination and sent it to the full Senate for consideration before the August recess. There's little doubt that Kagan will be confirmed, but the NRA continues to warn senators not to be fooled again. In this latest ad that ran in the Politico and on Fox News, the NRA points out that Justice Sonia Sotomayor told senators under oath during her hearings that she supported the Second Amendment, but ruled exactly the opposite first chance she got. And now another Obama nominee for the Supreme Court, Elena Kagan, is saying the same thing using exactly the same words. And the ad goes on to say that the Constitution deserves more than lip service and urges senators to vote no on Elena Kagan. And finally, the NRA honors U.S. Army Sergeant Nick Randstad of Battle Lake, Minnesota, for his courage and commitment while serving in Afghanistan. Sergeant Randstad holds the U.S. military record for sniper operations in Afghanistan and is now stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The sniper ghillie suit used by him is now on permanent display at the NRA Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. And from all of us to all our men and women on the front lines, thank you for all you do every day to keep America free. On that note, that wraps up our show for today, but be sure to tune in at 9 p.m. Eastern for Cam & Company right here on NRAnews.com and Sirius XM Patriot, and we'll look for you right back here tomorrow here at the United Nations, same place, same time for the Daily News. Have a great evening, everybody. I'm Ginny Simone.